what does it actually take to get a six pack?
Well, we should say one thing that there's no such thing as spot reduction. Fat is taken off evenly throughout the body. It's just not stored evenly, and your genetic predisposition is going to determine where you have your troubled spots, the ones that are last to go, because that's where you tend to store fat. So we should be cautious to say that the same principles for getting a six pack are the same as the most beneficial method of losing weight. It's 90% of it's done in the kitchen, and then you've got your weight training and the like. So oftentimes what people will do is they'll start doing these sit-up programs to get a six-pack. The ab muscles are like any other muscle, and you train them with the same type of stimulus, twice a week, 5 to 10 sets through a full range of motion with sufficient effort and intensity to stimulate a response. But they're not huge muscles. The rectus abdominis are just a small layer of muscle. They look great, sure, but you're not going to show abs by doing tons and tons of sit-ups. It's not the biggest return on your investment. If you're trying to to burn calories, doing sit-ups isn't the way you would do it. You'd want to get your legs or back or your larger muscle groups in motion if you want to burn more calories. Sit-ups is not the way to do it. So we're back to abs are built in the kitchen. We're back to losing body fat, and then everybody has a different body fat percentage at which they'll display abdominals, and everybody has different abdominal muscle size and appearance. People have different bicep peaks. People have different lat lengths, and every muscle, has a different appearance on different people. It's kind of genetically determined. If you have big blocks, or if you have kind of a more shallow abdominal wall, it's going to influence it. Women will have a harder time than men because they tend to carry more body fat as a result of their genetics as well. So it's just a matter of how lean can you get before you start showing it. And there comes a point at which, and I've said this before, if you want to be healthy, don't compete. There becomes a point at which that level of leanness starts to compromise your general health. It can compromise your sleep. It can compromise your hormones. With women, as we talked about earlier, the female triad, cessation, the amenorrhea, anemia, a whole host of problems there. So I'm not suggesting that is a healthy goal. Some people, it's easier than others. It might be neat to try and do and see how you feel. But something that's more sustainable long term, where you feel good, where you feel healthy. There's a broad range of BMI that allows you to still experience all the benefits of health span and lifespan without having a six pack.
Well, I think for the person that wants to do it in a healthy way and they're training full body, they're eating enough protein, they're eating enough calories, if they get to a healthy body fat percentage and a percentage of leanness where their abs could potentially start to show, if they don't do any ab work specifically, will their ab muscles still pop out, or does somebody need to actually train them so that when they get that lean, they'll pop out and they'll have like the wall that you see?
It makes sense to train them, but they're not a large muscle. Again, the genetic predisposition as to how bulky that muscle is very individualistic. So, I mean, it always makes sense to train all the muscles, but I don't think it's the primary driver of showing abdominals. Primary driver's obviously going to be weight loss, just exposing that sheath of muscle in the abdomen. And one of the biggest challenges is what do your muscles look like, but more than that, B, where is your genetic predisposition for storing body fat? Some people may have to get very, very, very lean. And it's important to recognize that people have different body fat storage, not just the location, but the amount they're able to store. The subcutaneous fat, that's under the skin, women in particular tend to hold that in their hips and their butt, men in their belly and their obliques. The subcutaneous fat is not as detrimental to your health as the visceral fat. Some people don't have a lot of capability of storing subcutaneous fat, and they almost and they preferentially, or I would just say sooner than others, start to store it internally, viscerally around the organs. Fatty liver, NAFLD, becomes kind of the first place, and then from there goes out into pancreatic fat. That's through what I think. I don't want to attempt his name, but the twin cycle hypothesis of obesity is where NAFLD, liver fat, spills over into pancreatic fat, which what causes insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. I know some people will claim the carbohydrate insulin model, whereby if you eat a grape and your insulin goes up, that you're going to become diabetic, but that's not the case. The fact is that's putting the cart before the horse. The horse is, is your liver healthy enough to handle the carbohydrate storage, and do you have enough storage? Once your energy toxicity takes place when all your storage sites are full, when you filled up your fat storage, and again, that's genetically different for different people. I have a relative that was of Indian descent who was very small in his legs and arms, but had a little pot belly. And he he had gotten type 2 diabetes, but his BMI was normal, but he was what we call TOFI, thin on the outside, fat on the inside. We see this with some athletes. I experienced the same thing. I think people saw me at 300 pounds. I still had a six pack. Eddie Hall at 400 pounds still had abs, but he had an enormous amount of visceral fat underneath, which drives the health problems. That's the unhealthy fat, causing insulin resistance. Now, it's a little harder. You can last a little longer as a bodybuilder with insulin resistance, or at least the evolution of insulin resistance, because you're training your muscles so much that the muscles will take up glucose in the absence of need of insulin. But at some point, you can even overwhelm that workload. So that's something to consider.
When it comes to specifically training abs, you talked about, I think you mentioned something about people, I think, doing a bunch of crunches or some sort of ab program to get the abs. And for a while, it was like the protocol was do something like 3 sets of 25 crunches, do some hanging leg raises, do trunk twists, stuff like that. And lately I've heard, like you just said, train the abs like any other muscle. There's this, I don't know if it's a hammer strength machine or something, but it's my favorite ab machine where it's like a machine ab crunch, but they let your knees come up too. And it's almost like a double crunch, like your knees come up and you can, to me, that's like the best, in my opinion, machine for at least working my abs. But I'd love to hear your thoughts, like for the person who wants to train them properly to hit the rectus abdominis, transverse abdominis, and really build things properly. Like, what are some of your favorite exercises for it?
Yeah, I think for the rectus abdominis in particular, you got to be careful that you're not training your hip flexors. When you lift your legs up, there has to be some amount of hip rotation, upward hip rotation. So if you're doing, say, a hanging leg raise, it's not enough just to lift your knees up. You actually want to try and curl your hips forward. That's where the rectus abdominis starts to pull your hips up towards your rib cage. And so that's important. A full range of motion under load would be nice. And I think one of the ones I like the best now is I saw Dr. Soko, PhD exercise phys, Dr. _ Soko. He does a fantastic job. He's more along the Dorian Yates, higher intensity, lower volume, closer to failure, but a lot of lengthened partials at the very end of the workout. But he does one in particular where he'll lay flat on a bench press and maybe hold on to the bench bar and let all of his legs and most of his butt hang off the edge of the bench. So you're laying down like you're doing a bench press, but you've scooted forward until your butt cheeks are actually in the air. They're not supported by the bench, right? Just maybe the top portion of your butt cheeks are supported by the bench. And then you got to reach back and hold on to something. And then let your legs hang over that bench. And imagine your heels going almost all the way to the ground. Now, imagine the stretch of your rectus abdominis. That's a lengthened position. As we've all, of course, everybody's now heavy on full range of motion and stretch mediated hypertrophy. It's kind of hard to stretch the rectus abdominis under load. Well, under that scenario, you can see that if your heels are below your glutes, because you're laying on a bench and you're bringing your heels down with straight legs or relatively straight legs, bring your heels down almost to the floor. Now you can almost, as I'm talking about it, feel your abdominals stretching over that, over the edge of that bench. And then if you put a little dumbbell between your heels and then you try and roll your hips back up. Now, some people might just try and bring their knees towards their hips. Not as effective as if you bring your knees up just a little bit, but then try and curl the hips, your glutes towards your rib cage, and then add weight. Hold a dumbbell between your feet as you progress this over time. And the load could be, 8 to 12 reps, like I say, like any other muscle, and that would be a great exercise with the SoCo ab curl. I'm not sure if it's been named yet, but he does a great job on his site of showing it. That's one of my favorites. I've always done either hanging leg raises, or you get into that one machine that allows you to sit on your elbows. That apparatus allows you to sit on your elbows and hold onto the handles with your feet down below you. The problem is that when your feet are fully extended, there's no load on the abdominals. It's kind of like dumbbell curls when you're doing them standing. When you're standing doing dumbbell curls, your arms are hanging to your side, there's no load, which is why we like to sit people down and lean them back slightly. And so then when the dumbbells are hanging uh, at full extension, there's actually still load on the muscle. And the loaded position at full stretch appears to be the most beneficial for hypertrophy, not necessarily the contraction position, the top 90 degrees of the movement.
What do you say to the people who, when they're thinking about losing some of the belly fat or even just losing body fat in general, they're like, I got to cut out carbs, I got to cut out sugar. Like, once I do that, the fat will just disappear. What do you say to people who say that?
It's unnecessary. We have plenty of research showing that whether you're doing high carb or low carb, if you equate for calories and protein. The Diet Fits trial out of Stanford was 600 people for a year, and they divided them into groups, high carb, low carb, and they had equivalent fat loss outcomes when they equated for protein and calories. And there was no difference in glycemic control. And this was Gary Taubes. It was his group participated in the funding of the test. And Gary Taubes is quite a notable keto zealot. So I'm not suggesting that keto isn't uh, uh, an effective method for weight loss, but it's not the best. It's not any better than. That's the problem, I think, when people get into these tribes. We talked about this off air before we jumped on. If you do something that works for you, that's great, but you can't extrapolate that onto the rest of the population and claim that it's better than any other diet just because it worked for you. It's better for you, but there's many paths to the same destination. And the best diet's the one you'll follow. And that includes whether it's a keto, a paleo, an intermittent fasting diet, a high carb diet. I think Peter Attia put it together best when he said there's only three types of diets. Every diet that we discuss falls into one of three categories: CR, DR, and TR. Calorie restriction, you track and weigh all your food. You look at the labels and at the nutrient facts, and you use your tracker, and you track all of your calories that you eat every day. That's calorie restriction. DR is dietary restriction. Cut something out. That's your keto folks, your paleo folks. Just eliminate a food group. Get rid of carbs. And if that creates a calorie deficit for you, great, you're going to lose weight. TR is time restriction, whether it's alternate day fasting, OMAD, one meal a day, 16/8, or any combination thereof. That is time restriction. Every single diet ever used by man will fall under one of those three categories, and they're all equally effective, but it's very individualistic. And when you have trials assessing the effectiveness of any of those individual diets, you find a lot of inter-individual variability. You find that people undergoing any specific diet trial, whether it's keto or intermittent fasting or paleo or any of the diet fads, we could call them, you find that some people lose weight, some people gain weight. Some people lose a lot of weight. Some people gain a lot of weight. Some people don't lose any. Exists on this wide spectrum of individual responses to these diets. So when someone tries one of these diets, carnivore, put them on the list. And it works for them. They often it becomes a religion, unfortunately, and then they have to start trying to demonize what other people are doing or make claims about the dietary guidelines and all of those things, and then start blaming the government for our weight gain and blah blah blah. It's unnecessary. It's childish. It's not scientifically supported. I think that the good news is and should be that people have options, and if they don't like keto, then they can try intermittent fasting. If they don't like that, they can try counting calories. There's many options, and some people find that or go vegetarian or vegan. I mean, they all have. What's interesting is that all of these different diet tribes have testimonials that they refer to. I love listening to the medical doctors in particular when you interview them talk about their specific bias, their diet tribe. They're like, oh, well, in my clinical experience, they talk about their testimonials and their anecdotes. Everybody has clinical experience. Everybody has anecdotes and testimonials. I've helped thousands of people lose weight, but I'm not arrogant enough or ignorant enough of the science at large from everything we just discussed to make a claim that other diets can't work. There are pros and cons to each diet. Some people don't like counting calories. It becomes, obnoxious to them. If you're on a keto diet and you're particularly susceptible to high LDL and you're consuming massive amounts of butter and bacon, you're going to increase your cardiovascular disease risk. Can you do keto more responsibly? Yep, you can. Get a blood test, find out if you're susceptible, and then make those changes. Reduce your saturated fat, increase your polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats. Intermittent fasting. Some people can go so extreme, and people who are intermittent fasting zealots. Dr. Peter Attia, brilliant individual, Stanford MD, Harvard or Johns Hopkins oncology surgeon. I think he's highly regarded. Well, we all know his history. He's evolved. He used to be a carbohydrate insulin model zealot. He used to fast, and he fasted for extended periods of time. And he was a keto for like 3 years, pissing on keto sticks. And he's finally emerged on the other end after much research and much patience on our part, observing this from afar, because he is a brilliant guy, to understand that the energy balance equation is ultimately what determines weight loss and not some special benefit from intermittent fasting or keto, although they can certainly be effective. It's not for everyone, and there's pros and cons to each. But one of the biggest downfalls, I would say, of intermittent fasting, particularly when you get down to OMAD, and this is what Dr. Peter Attia experienced with follow-up DEXA scans, is the potential for lean mass loss. It may be hard to get enough calories or enough protein on one meal a day. We do have some research to suggest that you could probably do okay with 2 meals a day, but the International Society of Sports Nutrition proposes 3 to 4 meals a day to optimize lean mass retention, or performance in particular. And carbohydrates are obviously highly beneficial for performance, and we see that repeatedly in the research, in the sports nutrition research from the ISSN. So, I mean, there's things to consider. What's your priority? What's your goal? I think what Lane says is find the diet that feels the least restrictive to you, the one that you can adhere to long term. It doesn't make you hangry. There's a host of different tools that we put in our toolbox to help people with satiety: higher protein, higher fiber, more fluid intake, less ultra processed foods, more whole foods. That's about all we got until you start getting into the medications. And I know it sounds cliche, and it doesn't work for everyone because people have different hormonal signals, as you know. Some folks have higher hunger signaling, more ghrelin. They have leptin resistance, to where they don't feel satiated as quickly as others. And that's probably one of the major reasons that people fail on the diet is that they can't, is that they hormonally are hungrier than other people, and so they eat more often. Many people will propose that intermittent fasting cures that or keto cures that, and it doesn't. There's no long-term evidence that either of those diets are any more effective than all the other diets I mentioned for long-term dietary adherence, and they've studied them at length. And that's why, without getting into all the pros and cons, that's why uh, it's evidenced best by the success of those new semaglutide medications. They simply make you feel full. You're not hungry. You lose the food noise. You're not thinking about food all the time. There's certainly some downsides to that, but it evidences the fact that it is satiety ultimately. Long-term dietary adherence in trials over 2 years show about an average of a 2% weight loss. On these semaglutide medications, 17 to 23% weight loss adhered over a 2-year time period. It's extraordinary. It's basically because of hunger, of taking care of people's satiety and need to overeat. And those people who argue against that kind of thing should understand that it is hormonal. It's a funny thing about the carbohydrate insulin model people is that they're like, oh no, it's insulin. That's the reason that you're gaining weight, because your insulin went up. As discussed earlier, that's putting the cart before the horse. But if you're going to argue that the carbohydrate insulin model is valid, and then not recognize that obesity is hormonal, that you're talking out of both sides of your mouth. And so that's why those folks with the carbohydrate insulin model should be the most supportive of the medications, because it solves the problem that they believe exists with insulin.
This episode is brought to you by Element. Whether or not you're working out, hydration is so important. Water alone is key, but drinking water on its own sometimes just doesn't cut it. That's where Element electrolytes come in. They have formulated a science-backed electrolyte ratio that tastes absolutely amazing. Plus, it doesn't have any sugar, artificial colors, or other sketchy ingredients to hold you back. I've been using Element for years, and my favorite flavor is definitely the citrus salt. I take it either first thing in the morning when I wake up or after a workout or a run. After taking it, I always feel replenished and ready to move on to the next thing I am doing. I know when I'm properly hydrated, I perform and feel my best. So if you're looking to optimize your hydration, go to drinklmnt.com/DougBopst to get a free sample pack with any purchase. Again, go to drinklmnt.com/DougBopst or click the link below for a free sample pack with any purchase. Now back to the show.